A very warm welcome to this special webinar event brought to you by the Critical Path Institute. It is a special event because we'll be discussing today a very important manuscript which had wide engagement in terms of development and also represented a unique collaboration for us between the Critical Path Institute and the eClinical Forum. Welcome. We're going to briefly introduce the panelists to you today. I'm moderating today. My name's Scotty Kern from the Critical Path Institute, and I have the privilege of leading the eCOA consortium, one of the entities involved in the development of the paper we're going to be discussing today. And you will see we also have the wisdom and benefit of having Trish DeLong from Johnson & Johnson and Damien Humler from Clario, both of whom actually, from the CPAR perspective, co-led the development of the paper we'll be discussing today. And representing the eClinical Forum today, we have Alan Yeomans from VDoc, and we'll be hearing from all of them very shortly. So we're going to take you through a few administrative items, if we may first. First of all, sorry, slightly overkeen Zoom feature there. Our standard disclaimer that the views and opinions are those of the individual presenters and should not be attributed to the eClinical Forum, CPAth, or their respective organisations, and the intellectual property are those of the presenters themselves. Also, we'd like to share an acknowledgement of the funding situation for the Critical Path Institute. The Critical Path Institute on an organisational level does receive funding from the US Food and Drug Administration, but with the respective consortia, the eCOA consortium and the PRO consortium, are funded by membership fees from their respective members. Similarly applies for the eClinical Forum. And again, the intellectual property are those of the individual presenters. So a quick agenda for you of what we're going to cover today, a quick background in terms of where this whole thing came from. It's an engaging topic, a provocative topic, and one that's caused challenge for many years, as we'll illustrate in this background summary shortly. And then I'll hand over to Alan to talk through the objective of the paper that ultimately was generated. We have some to share some of the key challenges and basically the core detail, the recommendations within the paper. And then we'll invite questions. We'll have a Q&A section at the end. I'd like to draw your attention to the Q&A feature in Zoom. So the questions will all be handled via the Q&A feature. We won't be opening up the microphones for people to verbally post their questions. If you have a question, please post it in the Q&A function. Do not use the chat. Please do not use the chat. That's just for any technical issues you may be having, if Zoom's misbehaving as it can do on occasion. My colleague Christian Noel will help deal with any issues you may be experiencing. But if you have questions on what we're saying or the paper in general, or perhaps even a comment that you'd like to make, please post it in the Q&A and then we'll get those addressed at the end of the event. So a quick overview of the respective entities. The patient-reported outcome, or PRO consortium, formed in 2008, one of the very first consortia created by CPAth, and the mission to establish and maintain a collaborative framework with appropriate stakeholders for the qualification of PROs and other COAs. And to be fair, the PRO consortium does an awful lot more than this as well. Similarly for the eCOA consortium, which at the time this whole project began was actually still called the ePro consortium. And we changed our name a couple of years ago to better represent our membership and what we actually do. But our mission is advancing the science of clinical trial endpoint assessment through collaborations like this. And the eClinical Forum, again, I've looked at the trying to provide service or resources for those industries involved in the clinical research, but focusing on the electronic data capture, the systems, the process, and the responsibilities involved. And I'd urge you, if you haven't, to take a look at the eClinical Forum's website to see some of the excellent material they've generated over the last 24 years, astonishingly. And with that, let's take a little time to reflect on the background of how this all came about. I think anyone who's been involved in eCOA for any length of time, for me, it's 21 years now, terrifyingly enough. There has been a situation for many, many years where providers, eCOA providers, were implementing customized data change rules, if you will, which would often be developed in collaboration with a sponsor. And they would actually arrive at a situation where they would define where data changes were permitted and who would be involved in that process. And often the process found sponsors requiring the ownership of approval, that step to approve any data change request that the site staff are generated. And so some other kind of approaches that I've seen, and to be transparent with you, I've been part of the decision process on this. No changes allowed to patient-entered data is a policy statement that's existed for many years. And if the data, the eCOA data is supporting an endpoint, particularly a primary endpoint, then maybe in that scenario, the sponsor would need that step to actively approve a data change that's made. But back in 2016-17, the MHRA published their critical findings for a trial where they observed that the data generated through an e-diary, an ePro device, was not able to be changed. And as a result, consequently, that the data that was erroneous was used in the analysis, which from a regulatory perspective is obviously a serious concern. And in this scenario, it seems that while the site actually requested the change, they weren't allowed to make the change. And MHRA's general commentary on this is that this illustrates a loss of control per GCP, a loss of control of their own data at that clinical site. And between the phase of database lock and the archive process, in terms of the PDFs being issued, PDFs themselves only actually contain the final version of data and had limited metadata, so audit trails and other components. So again, those on this call will be familiar with many of these challenges. So that was I guess the concept that drew this group together to try and do something about it. And so Alan's going to share some details about how the project began.
Right. Thank you very much, Scotty. So we started off, as Scotty mentioned, there are actually 3 different groups, and we started off with 3 different initiatives to look at writing some sort of recommendations or a white paper or best practices about how we should handle data changes to the patient-reported data. And once we realized that we were all 3 working on more or less the same thing, it made sense to actually combine our groups, and that's what we did. And that's how we ended up being 3 different organizations working on this paper. But we thought that by doing so, we were bringing together all of the experts from right around the world to look at the same problem. Now, the challenges, Scotty's already been in on those a little bit, but the main one is that there are a number of regulatory references that the authorities assumed were clear, but which when we look at them in detail, there is ambiguity. So, I mean, there are, and these are from the FDA and the EMA and the GCP, but there are similar regulations in many parts of the world, and there's a lot more detail in the white paper. So if you're interested in the regulatory background, please read the white paper for more information. But basically, the investigator is the one who's required to maintain and record all of the data. And there's supposed to be a procedure that will allow people to change erroneous data. But at the same time, the sponsor is responsible for oversight and also for providing a process and educating investigators on what they need to do and how they need to think. And then any change or correction has to be dated and explained, and sponsors should provide guidance to investigators, it says here. So I don't think we were, in the industry, we were actively doing anything we thought was wrong. We all thought we were approaching this thing exactly in the spirit of the regulations. But the authorities didn't always see it the same way. I just want to talk about one of the guidelines in a little bit more detail because it's the latest one. Came out last year. And the authorities have tried to clarify even more what they mean. So this includes some of the text that's in the other guidelines, but also some clarifications. And all of the authorities, the FDA, the EMA, the PMDA, they all mean that this is what they've meant all along. So this is not a change in the regulations. It's just a clarification of how they expect the existing regulations to be interpreted. So they mean this is equally applicable. All of the regulations, they talk about data, electronic data being recorded. That also applies to ePro, as they've written in the guideline. And there should be a process in place to address the situation when the data originator wants to make a change. The data is incorrect and they want to change it. That should be possible. And the data reported should always be reliable, meaning that if a mistake's been made, then the data should be changed in order to make it reliable, so that the data integrity is preserved. Going on that way, they say that if there's a need to make a change and it's justified, then it should be handled in a timely manner. So this is not something that should wait to the end of the trial and be done afterwards. But they also talk about recall bias, which is something we're familiar with, all of us. We all worry a bit about recall bias. The patient who calls up the next day and says, oh, it didn't really hurt that much, I want to change my answer. But they should make sure that corrections should not be done at a much later stage without good reason and justification. So again, it comes back to the justification. They mean it's all right to ensure that recall bias is minimized, but you can't stop all changes because you're scared of recall bias. They do, however, expect the number of changes to ePro data to be limited. And we've heard examples, and I'm sure many of you have heard examples, where one site has had a lot more ePro data changes than other sites. And that's the sort of thing that you should look at very carefully. So summarizing those challenges, there have been a number of issues that have been identified in regulatory inspections. Questions around sponsors having exclusive control of the data. Changes that have been made without the site knowing or acknowledging them. And also loopholes in process that would enable sponsors to exert control over site data, which is something authorities don't like. Sponsors should never have control of the site data. There's also the challenge of applying the regulations in a uniform way. There have been procedures from a number of different bodies, we all know that, but our studies are more and more global. We want the same rules to apply everywhere, otherwise things become very difficult. And again, we talk about not providing uniform guidance on the appropriateness of data modifications. It's something that can be interpreted in different ways. There are varying implications of changing the data that need to be taken into account, because not all data changes have the same impact. Some revisions may impact critical study outcomes, for example, patient inclusion or exclusion, if you change some of that data, or key endpoints, the things that you're looking to examine in your trial. So let's set the scene. Let's talk about a typical sort of scenario where we should be making a data change. A patient's completed their questionnaire, sent it off, and then sometime later, the next day or the day after or the week after, when they go to fill in the questionnaire again, they realize that they got the ends of the scale confused. And what they thought was most pain was actually least pain. And so they answered a 3 when they meant to answer a 7, and they need to change their answer. So the question is, how do we handle that sort of a change? And I'd like to hand over to Trish DeLong now.
Thanks so much, Alan. So I'm going to take you through kind of not just jumping in and kind of divulging the secret sauce, but really kind of taking a step back and kind of take you through the journey that we went through when we combined forces and started to kind of go through this journey and writing this paper together. So really, as Scotty and Alan described, like the challenges we had and how can we kind of come together and have something consistent across sponsors and providers, but also provide that flexibility and real life, scenarios that happen that you've all experienced on a day-to-day. So as you can imagine, it's very complex, but we really wanted to kind of balance all of these things. So we consider the sponsor point of view, the ECOA provider system solution, as well as the site and patient control over the data, and then all while maintaining compliance with our regulatory and health authority requirements. So now we're going to take you into the recommendations. Where we started was we actually dived right into the process with our working group, and we had to kind of hash out a couple discussions, and we could not come to a consensus or agreement. We all came in with our different perspectives, whether it was like we can't change anything, nothing must be changed, or everything may be changed and we got to be super flexible. So we kind of had the spectrum of different principles and ideas. So what we did is we needed a North Star, and that's what the core principles are. It's really our North Star that we came together and created to align all the various stakeholders and everyone's points of view. Because then with that core principle, we were really able to drive forward, drive change, and come together and create this best practice recommendation, okay? And then we'll take you through the site control responsibilities, sponsor oversight, what we mean by that, creating this thing that we're calling an oversight plan, what that entails, includes roles and responsibilities. And then finally, we'll wrap it up with risk mitigation and talk about some of those edge cases or scenarios that may happen, you know, in each of the trials that you may be working on. Okay. So I know there's a lot written here. We had to split it up into 2 slides. I'm going to take you pretty quickly through this. It's obviously in the paper. You can reference that as needed. But really, we want to get to the crux of the topic here and the challenges, which is the process itself and how we handle it in this oversight plan. So just number 1, in accordance with definition of PRO, clinical data values should always reflect the respondent's chosen response without bias or interpretation by a third party. So obviously, I think we can all agree on that. It's very important to maintain that. Number 2, clinical data values should be recorded in a manner consistent with the user guide and administration instructions of that assessment from that copyright holder. Data changes should not be permitted if the revised value could be a subject to source of bias that could call into question the validity and integrity of the data. Very important. Number 3, source data changes should not compromise compliance with Alcoa. Okay. And number 4, all data changes should be fully recorded in the system's audit trail to enable the site to have access to the complete eSource record and also allow sponsors to determine and document entries to be included or excluded from that statistical analysis. Okay, and then 5 through 7. So 5 is I'm going to stop on 5 a little bit and talk about that. So sponsors have the responsibility for oversight of the service provider, including the development of this oversight plan or data management plan that we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail. Whoops. Oops, something happened there. Okay, yep, thank you. So really, we're going to talk about the identification of critical data points. So what does that mean? It's something we do define in the paper and we'll talk about in subsequent slides. It's really something that impacts efficacy or safety data. And then also what we mean by non-critical, which is really everything else. So like all the metadata or complementary data within the system. It could be system generated data as well. Then expectations for the investigative site around the DCR, what the process, documentation requirements are, and then really how we notify the sponsor. So what's the sponsor's role? How should they be notified? Where their roles and responsibilities lie between the DCR and all the stakeholders involved. And then training, really making sure that you know sponsors have a responsibility to train sites and everything is documented in that oversight plan. Number 6, sites are expected to submit the DCRs related to the clinical data when discrepancies are found. So the sites need to go in and authorize that on behalf of the patient if the patient is the data originator. And changes to the system data or metadata should be handled independently of this workflow. So any type of data processing, post-processing is independent of this workflow. And then number 7, eSource data changes should be supported by documentation to reconstruct the ECOA data events. So we need to make sure that we can reconstruct exactly what happened. So the site personnel, date and time stamps, date of the change, justification, rationale, all agreed upon with that data originator, such as the patient, that change was requested. Okay, now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Damien to take us through the process.
Thank you, Trish. So with that problem statement in mind, site control over source, sponsor oversight over the trial, what was our proposal for handling data change requests? And what we landed on starts with an oversight plan, essentially. Some of us might refer to this as a data management plan. It might go by other names, but the principle is to have a working living document that governs how we're going to handle change requests for each type of data, each type of scenario. in the study. And in there, we can then define which data types we consider critical and which types we consider to be non-critical or procedural, if you like that word. We've given some examples here of data types that tend to be critical to a trial. Primary endpoint, as Scotty has previously mentioned, participant safety, related data, patient entered, etc. But this is a flexible approach, and every study is going to have different needs, and we understand that. But this is where we start. So once you have that, then you have to essentially define the process where all parties are going to be satisfied with what we're trying to achieve. And what that looks like from a system point of view is something like this. So we start with the patient and the site discussing whatever it is that that's occurred. The site submits the request into the service provider database. At that point, imagine that you have two things happening simultaneously. On the one hand, you have you go back to that site and you just gently require that they confirm they have documentation supporting the change that they're requesting. Maybe that's the conversation with the patient, right? What happened? If there's a technical issue, describe it, etc. And at exactly the same time, we're notifying the sponsor. Now, this diagram sort of suggests that there's a site, there's a sponsor, there's nothing in between. So we might imagine that this is a kind of automated system. This service provider doesn't have necessarily people standing in the middle, but things are configured and automated. So again, just to restate, the site confirms, the sponsor is notified. It's not a request for the sponsor to approve the change. It's not an opportunity for the sponsor to reject the request. It's just a notification. And what happens there is what Trish described as, I think, the magic sauce. The sponsor may reach out directly to the site or via the CRA to discuss the request if there are concerns. The site, at the end of the day, either confirms in response to the service provider query or they cancel their request. Okay. You can see there's a decision point here in orange about what happens if those two parties don't agree, and we will talk about that in a few slides. But let me show you the same concept here with the service provider in the middle. So again, it's the same concept, but there are people evaluating and triaging each request in accordance with that oversight plan. And if the request meets certain criteria as outlined in the oversight plan, the DCR is sent back to the site for that confirmation. The sponsor is notified. A conversation, should it be required, happens offline between those two parties. Again, in the bottom right, we have this, well, what if the parties don't agree? And again, we will talk about that. But what we're trying to achieve is really just upholding the regulatory guidances that Alan was showing us, whereby the site maintains control over the source data and the sponsor maintains awareness of what's happening and can influence those conversations as necessary. Okay. If you break it down into responsibilities and roles, it looks something like this. And I think one of the key benefits of this process is simply the transparency that's involved. If we think about those 15-year ago conversations where changes were simply not permitted, you ended up with sites asking for things, being told, sorry, we can't do that according to the sponsor, and that was the end of the discussion. Well, here, if a site is submitting a request that potentially is unwarranted or where the documentation isn't really solid, there's an opportunity for the sponsor and the site to discuss that and learn from each other about what's happening. The service provider, meanwhile, is supporting both parties and their distinct regulatory responsibilities. And ideally, everybody wins. Okay. I will pass it back to Trish.
Thanks, Damien. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about risk mitigation, because I'm sure, you know, all of you on the call have experienced different scenarios, different edge cases. So each provider, as you can imagine, has a different process, different technology, different ways of working. So we designed the oversight plan to be really technology agnostic, and then divide those responsibilities, you know, keeping in mind the platform and the technology provider that you're working with. So we do not have unique scenarios in the oversight plan, things like derived or calculated variables, eligibility changes, resulting in changes of the PRO or ECOA data. And then some scenarios may involve different errors like downstream impacts of one data change. So really just going through our mitigations, you know, each service provider has their own platform. Sponsors are working with them and need to kind of come to an agreement on how this should be handled. Sites are able to confirm the documentations are in place. Sponsors can monitor the DCR trends across different sites to ensure the data integrity is maintained. Obviously, this is something that you would want to kind of version up, and as new things arise or new scenarios, it can be added to this oversight plan. So it can be all encompassing. It's not a one and done type thing. Special instructions for the nuances of the clinical trials around like derived variables, inclusion, exclusion criteria definitely should be added to that oversight plan. And then really key is number 5 here on the right-hand side, really ensure regular discussions occur between that service provider and the sponsor to really ensure all these different scenarios are accounted for as it gets more complex with, you know, across the different therapeutic areas that you may be working on. Okay, so really kind of one of the big key things coming out of this is like, what if you fail to agree? What if the site and sponsor have a disagreement? Site is saying, you know, ABC, sponsor says, well, no, X, Y, Z. We really, what do we do? What happens? So really, based on our interpretation of the laws and coming to an agreement with our working group, if a sponsor disagrees with a site initiated data change request based on the current regulations, they cannot prohibit the change. So sponsors cannot stop the change midstream and say, hey, no, we want to reverse this, okay? So what should be done with the mitigations, sponsors can and should discuss their concerns with the site. If the site decides to reverse or withdraw that request, it's the discretion of the site. If the change is implemented, the sponsor can decide whether the modified data should be excluded from that final analysis, either by flagging the data in the transfer or by documenting the concern in the data analysis plan, and possibly allowing for that sensitivity analysis of the results with or without that modified data to see if it has any impact. Okay. So just to wrap up our presentation today, I know we threw a lot at you, and of course the paper has all of this information plus more details. So really, like when we came together with the 3 groups, we really wanted to make sure we had a consistent approach to this across the board, that we're allowing for sites to able to fulfill their responsibility for data accuracy. The service providers are able to support both sites and sponsors, and they're not stuck in the middle. Sponsor has increased awareness and visibility to the data changes, that we're not blind and not, you know, prohibited from looking at the data and their causes and justification. And then also importantly, sponsor does not have exclusive control over the source record, that there needs to be this balance between the site, the patient, the service provider, and the sponsor. And that we have retraining, you know, real-time updates as possible, you know, when things do arrive. And then really the intent of this is for that data originator to preserve the data. So if it's a patient in question, that they really have a voice in what has changed or what's not changed. I'm going to hand it over to Scotty to wrap it up and then open up the Q&A. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Trish, and Damien and Alan. So we want to take a moment to recognize the extensive group that was involved in this. Again, this from a CPAR perspective kind of started in 2018. But ultimately it was 2020 when these groups came together and really drove forward the the development of something that was necessary. I think one of the challenges we face with the use of these types of technologies is that we need to have a consensus document, a consensus reference that allows us to make balanced and informed decisions about how to use these systems. It's at the very core of what the ECO Consortium does and the Clinical Forum does, and also the PIRO Consortium. So these names here are the co-authors, quite a list there. Also some acknowledgements. I learned from Alan just earlier today that some of the contributors here were very much involved in the eClinical Forum's early efforts around this particular topic, but we want to make sure that they are recognised for their ultimate contribution to addressing a key issue in the use of ecosystems. But there is one name right at the end of the co-authored list that we'd like to spend a moment just reflecting on the importance of the individual. Steve Raymond, who tragically left us about this time, I think, last year. Someone who I've referred to as the godfather of ePro. For me, he was the real originator, the real thought leader in this space. We had the privilege, really, of having Stephen as our senior author on the paper. And really, I remember back in 2005-06 having discussions on this exact topic with Steve and learning from him what we had to consider and how to do things in a thoughtful fashion, but also to challenge the narrative and make sure that we come to a collective and balanced perspective in discussions with regulators and within and across sponsors, within providers as well. Steve, we sorely missed, and I think I'm personally delighted that I managed to get my name on a paper with someone who I really think is as I said, the godfather of ePro. Thank you, Stephen, for everything.
Hear, hear.
Thank you, Damien. One thing that Stephen was really good at was asking challenging questions. So I'll use that as a nice little inspirational point to appeal to you all as attendees today. We've got quite a few of you on the call to pose your questions, again, using the Q&A function if you would. We've got some great questions so far, which we're going to get through as many of these as we possibly can. So the first one is actually basically we've got a similar question from two different individuals, Adina Senneberg and also Meta Rosenfeld. And the question is around where data issues have been identified by the sponsor through oversight review, by data management review. How should the sponsor best bring this to the attention of the data originator in this case? Alan, would you mind taking the first crack at that?
Certainly, I'd be happy to. Yeah, as we all said earlier as well in the presentation, the sponsor is responsible for oversight. So this is just business as usual for a sponsor to go through the data and to find things you have questions about. The investigator and the site, they are responsible for the data itself. So your queries from a sponsor should always be addressed to the site, to the investigator, the same as you would for any data that have been entered by the site itself. And it's then up to the investigator to take it further and discuss it with the subject, who they know. They know who the person is. They can contact them directly, and they can take a discussion with them that way. But I would just say business as usual. You find something you have a question about, send it to the site as a query.
Any other
Hope
thoughts?
that answers the question. Yeah.
I think so, Alan. Any other thoughts? Damien, Trish? No. Okay. Let's move on to the next question. Thank you again, Adina and Meta, for that. Gosia Prokopovich, I think. Apologies for the awful pronunciation, I'm sure. But are there any recommendations around the time aspect, i.e. what is a acceptable time frame to change or instigate a potential change to a patient's response? So, for example, is 4 months after the event okay? Alan, let's stay with you on that one. What's your thoughts on that? And then I'd like to come to Damien for your perspective.
Yeah, this is something we discussed a lot in the team itself. This is not an easy one to address because I guess the only real answer is it depends, which doesn't help anyone at all. But it does depend on the data, and it depends on the situation, and it depends on the reason for wanting to make the change. And I guess what you really can do as a sponsor is you can sit down and say, well, what would an inspector say if they came and they looked and we either allowed this data change 4 months later, or we did not allow this data change 4 months later, how would the inspector react to the decision we made? Because that's what you have to justify. You have to be able to say to the inspector, we thought there was a really good reason for doing it this way, and that's what we've done. If you can answer that question, then I think you're okay. But I don't think you can, at least we couldn't think of one in the group, and we had a lot of very intelligent people talking about this. But there's no sort of hard and fast rule that after 6 months, 3 days, and 27 hours, you don't have to make any more changes. So, Demian?
Yeah, and I think we could tie this in with the next question as well. So,
All yours.
clearly, if you get there's a story behind every event, right? If you understand the details of what's happened, you can make an informed decision. And I think that conversation is really critical. So every situation is going to be different. There are presumably, and this is again the next question, Scotty, if you're okay, I'll read it.
You do.
It says, I assume, this is Richard Hodgson, I assume deletion of a record is also okay in the event the participant know the data they entered was wrong, but can no longer remember the actual answers. If you get to a point where the data is simply has a question mark over it, I think we all agree that, okay, deletion is one blunt option. If the data simply cannot be confirmed to be valid or not. But we've also talked about how annotation of the data, flagging of data may be an appropriate way so that the sponsor gets their submission data set and there are data points that maybe have a flag showing that something happened. So you can do your sensitivity analysis with and without that data. You can see sort of what happens to your statistical analysis by selectively saying, okay, we'll take that one out. But deletion is also, I think, an option. So agreeing with Alan that there is no golden rule here, I think the starting point is really to understand the details and then understand what is going to be best for the data for that situation.
Thanks so much, Damien and Alan. We're going to jump down the list a little bit and come to Trish, to you for this question, if we may. From Nicola Williamson, do these recommendations also apply to echo reported by the caregiver of a pediatric patient?
Yes. Yep. Easy question. Yes. We started off writing it, thinking about PROs in mind as our kind of our foundation, but then we kind of broadened it and made it a little bit more agnostic to data originator, which we mentioned a couple times in the paper, and that's really to be kind of agnostic of the folks entering into the ECOA. So yes.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Trish. I'd like to come to, if I may, to Damien again. We got a question again from Gosia. I'm not going to attempt your surname again, Gosia. I'm probably going to get it wrong. In the article, Damien, procedural data points are mentioned, but they are not clearly defined. Is there any documentation that can serve to understand what that definition is?
Well, I mean, we understand it to be basically time points, demographic, site entered decisions, subject statuses, things where a given value from the originator is not in question, right? I made a mistake and I did this, and now the patient needs to go somewhere else. But the key here with this oversight plan is that you can tailor it to do whatever your study needs it to do. So as an example, it's entirely possible that patient entered data of a certain kind is not considered critical in a study, right? It may be that dosing information entered daily by a patient is routinely changed and doesn't require this heightened sensitivity. That's not to say that it's procedural. It's to say that you can use the oversight plan to really focus on areas of sensitivity and criticality to the study. But just from my own perspective, I think everything outside of a clinical assessment kind of falls into that more procedural realm. And I'd like to know if Alan and Trish have anything to add to that. Or Scotty.
Yeah, it's kind of the catch-all, because we talked about, we defined the critical data points as, things like eligibility, PRO data, that type of thing. And then everything else is procedural. So it's really kind of up for interpretation based on the trial data and how it's written in the protocol and the study design and the endpoint hierarchy and all of that. So it's like all the other metadata, all those other things that are not critical would be that procedural.
Well said, Trish. Not a lot I can add to that.
I applaud that one as well. Wholehearted response. Can I remind everyone attending today, we welcome your questions. Thank you so much for everyone getting engaged. If you put the question in the chat, it will not be answered. Please put the questions in the Q&A function, and then we'll make sure we've got plenty of time, and we'll hopefully get through most of them. So please make sure you use the Q&A function and not the chat for your questions. I'd like to come to Trish. Actually, Trish, I'll stay with you on this one, because this is a question I remember from decades ago when I first started making bad decisions in eCOA, from our treasurer colleague and a very good friend of Steve Raymond's, Donna Reed, regarding system-generated date timestamps that are proven to be accurate. What should happen when a site requests to change the date and time?
Yeah, that's a good one, because I mean, we with the rules that we have and with the everything that we put in place, like the site would be able to make that request and make that change. So that's where kind of that intervention and discussion needs to happen with the site, to really like ask why does this need to happen? We need that informed decision making. And if they're really, really, really pushing, then that's where we, sponsor and site fail to agree. That's that section in the paper that we talk about, like that change is authorized. So if we're wholeheartedly, morally against that change as a sponsor, and we think there's something else going on here, obviously that pathway needs to happen with escalations, if there's anything ethical that may be in question. But the crux of it, like the site is requesting that change, then that change needs to happen. But of course, the sponsor needs to be able to have those conversations with the site personnel.
Thank you, Trish. Nothing more to add on that, gentlemen? Okay, we're good. So let's turn to, we'll come to you, Alan, with this one. Alberto Andrews asks, in regard to the 7 core principles, is there any recommendation when data is generated in another system, for example, EDC, and then integrated with the eCOA system? Where should the data change be controlled from in terms of the system? So, Alan, any thoughts on that?
Yes, this is also something we've talked about quite a lot in the team. And it really depends on the technical solution you've chosen for your particular study. And that's why when Damien was presenting the process, he had 2 pictures. He had the theoretical process, which looked a bit simpler, which just basically talked about the responsibilities of the site and the sponsor. And then he had a more complicated process, which talked about when a particular vendor was involved for a particular study, then they would have to do things in that way. And that's the sort of process picture or diagram you need for every study. You need to decide, depending on the solutions you've chosen for eCOA and other allied solution systems like EDC, patient safety, and so on. You have to decide how those interact and who is going to be making the changes. Is it possible to make the eCOA changes directly in the eCOA system or the ECRF system, or does the vendor have to make the changes for you, etc.? That all varies depending on the systems you've chosen. So the first simplified process picture, that's the theory. And then based on your systems that you choose, you have to construct the more complicated process, which we have an example of in the paper, showing how it works for a particular type of system. So that's, I hope that answers your question, Alberto. It seems like I'm always answering it depends, but sometimes that is the answer.
It very much is, Alan. That's the reality. And that's why the guidance is there, right? That's why we put this together for people to point at. I'd like to address the question from Jennifer Gaffney, and Trish, I'm going to come to you on this one. Have you created an oversight plan template? I thought I heard Trish hint at this. Is that true, Trish?
Yes, that's an easy one again. It's one of the appendices of the paper, so it's in there as an example, kind of a starting point, so you can jump off of that and use that as a basis.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We've got another question. Let's come to Mary Sweeney. Asks, if you delete data, I would assume from an audit perspective, there should be sufficient audit trail to tell the story of what happened, right? Damien?
Yes. So back to this question, and I work as at a service provider, so I'm gonna have to defer on the details here to others with more expertise. But the idea would be that if a patient and a site have a discussion that something was done horribly incorrectly, there's a need to change one or many data points, that conversation is being documented somewhere. And then there's the DCR, which is another layer of documentation. So presumably some of the explanation ends up in that DCR. Then the form is deleted. It's tied in some way to that request from a site. You have this chain of custody going all the way back to the patient. Right? So that would be the short answer. Anything to add?
Okay, no additions from the group. Fairly tight answer and the right one for me as well. Thank you, Damien. Nicola Makadonsky asks, Alan, if I may come to you, for trials that are ongoing that have already put in place procedures which do not allow for specific changes, what should happen there? Should they be immediately reversed?
Yeah, well, basically what you're doing is not in compliance with what the authorities expect to see. You're saying just what the reason that we started writing this paper was because of inspection findings by the MHRA. Critical findings for a study, an ongoing study that was using an eCore provider and would not allow data changes. So I would absolutely say, yes, you've got to have some sort of procedure or process that will allow you to make data changes. Otherwise, it's the sponsor who's basically going to get into trouble in the end. Because when they're inspected, when they try to make the submission, if the authorities should discover this and decide that it was important data, then that's going to be a problem.
Fair point, Alan. Thank you so much for that, and thanks for the question. We also have a question from, oh, they're flying in. Another question from Jill Somerville. I hope you're doing well, Jill. Long time no speak. What if a data change request is impacting the eligibility of a subject? I think Trish touched on that a little earlier in the slide. So, and what if we see this happening often in a particular study? What's the approach there? What justification should be established in this case? Like, for example, I don't want to say this out loud, but I have to paper diary proof to be kept as source. Alan, what are your thoughts on that one?
Yeah, so we're talking about the one from Jill Somerville, sorry.
Yes.
Yes. This is something that I mentioned very quickly. It has been seen in studies, and this is where the sponsor oversight comes into play. You have to look into each of them. You should be talking to the site. You should be saying, and this is the critical data. We talked about this in the oversight plan as well. You should go to it. You should say to the site, well, why do you want to make the change? Have you documented it? What's your reason? What's your justification? And if you disagree with it, then we get to the case that Trish talked about in her slides, or our slides, but Trish talked about it, is what happens if you disagree with the site. There are a couple of other questions that touch on this as well further down in the list. But if there's a disagreement between the sponsor and the site, well, ultimately the sponsor has to decide what are they going to do with the data. Do they want to keep the data in the study? Do they want to remove it? Do they want to remove just that particular data point? Or do they want to remove that patient or that site? And this is something only the sponsor can answer. And it's something the sponsor has to justify and defend when they present it to the authorities at a later case or later state. So it's your problem, but think about it. So it's, yeah, I don't know. Anyone else like to add something?
I mean, each sponsor has, policies and things in place around, falsifying data, and have to be reported to IRBs, ECs, all of that. So like if it goes down that route, that's a whole different ball game and a whole different process.
Thank you both, Alan and Trish, for that one. And Trish, while we have you, let's stay with you as we've got And the always provocative Christian Canals from AstraZeneca. Hey, Christian, hope you're well. Has got a really intriguing question. I'd like to understand the thinking around the sponsor having the last word in deciding to include change data in an analysis or not. What are your thoughts on that, Trish?
Well, that's why we have like that general sponsor oversight, but not cherry picking. So the sponsor isn't embedded in that process. It's up to the site using the eCode provider technology to make that change. If it's something that is looking to be like fraudulent data or unethical data, like the sponsor does have that kind of last call to, report that site or report, the fraudulent data to the appropriate, ethics committees and health authorities. So that's kind of that last straw of not cherry pick. Exactly what we don't want to do is cherry pick the data, but we do want to allow for the appropriate oversight and have the sponsors aware, because what if there was fraudulent data, in the system and the sponsors didn't catch it? What does that mean? So in order to avoid that, that's why we have the process and the oversight plan written the way it's written.
Thank you so much, Trish. Appreciate that response to an intriguing question. I'd like to come to Damien and pose a question of my former colleague, Chris Dell. Hope you're well, Chris. Perhaps an edge case, but how to handle a scenario where the DCR is for a primary endpoint supporting question that had branching logic tied to it, so that changing the primary question would now require or disallow the subordinate question. I hope that sort of makes sense. We ask a question, the change would have basically made the prior question irrelevant. How do we deal with that? Damien, any thoughts?
It's a great question. You're going to see some messy edge cases, right? We know that. And so we're kind of back to, first of all, the oversight plan. Let's establish some rules for that situation. Let's try to be consistent. And then if the question is, did you have any pain? The patient answered no. And in retrospect, the answer should have been yes. And the follow-up question is, how bad was your pain on a scale of 1 to 100? You're going to be stuck to figure out what that secondary answer should have been, unless the patient is letting the site know pretty much immediately. So do you flag that data? Do you change the no to a yes and leave the secondary question blank? I think you will have to evaluate some cases on their own merits, but to whatever extent possible, the oversight plan is really helpful in providing ground rules for things that happen frequently. Happy to hear others' thoughts.
Okay, nothing more to add. We are coming up against time. We do have a lot of unanswered questions, so I apologize, we're not going to get to everything, but let's push on to try and get a couple more in. Trish, a question from Nicola Makedonsky again. If these procedures are being put in place, but the sponsors are pushing back, what can we refer them to review? Hopefully our paper.
Yeah, hopefully our paper, exactly. So in our paper, I mean, we have citations and references at the bottom. There's some, public information around the MHRA inspection findings. So usually when you put inspection findings in front of someone's face, that they will hear it and react pretty strongly to your position. So I would definitely, read through the paper, look at the references that we have in here, and then pull those references. That should be a good justification to kind of help with your case.
Thank you so much, Trish. Alan, we've got a question from Prajesh Patil. What are the procedures? Oh, sorry. When people add questions, it disappears. What are the procedures for handling changes? Sorry, people are adding questions and the question keeps jumping up on the screen. What are the procedures for handling changes to critical data in the ecosystem on sponsor request? And what implications would cancelling such requests have on the data transfer process? Alan?
Yeah, first of all, of course, there's the question about whether a sponsor can request data changes. And I'd like to say no. It's not the sponsor's data. They can't ask anyone to change it. But what they can do is they can query the data. They can say, we don't think this looks good. Can you please look at it? And they're asking the site, they're asking the investigator. It's the investigator's data. Even if it's been entered by the subject, it's classified as the investigator's data. And so that would be the query. The sponsor would send a query saying, we think there's something wrong with this data. Can you please have a look at it and get back to us? And if the site decides, no, there's nothing wrong, we like the data exactly the way it is, then we end up in this situation we were talking about earlier, where the sponsor and the site may not agree on the data. Or it could happen that the site looks at it and says, oh, you were right. We made a mistake. We've now changed it. So that would be what I would say. But please, the sponsor can't request data changes. They can only query the data.
And there is a question to that in the questions about, can the sponsor raise a DCF related to a patient's response? I think it's an interesting question. I agree with Alan. I think that's gone a little bit outside of best practices at that point. If you have a need for the sponsor to request changes, then we put in the paper that the investigator or delegate must also be signing off on those, right? Before they're implemented. But I think best practices would be no. I think the site, the requests of that kind should come from the site who have access to the source notes.
Okay, thank you so much. So we are going to have to wrap up now. I'm afraid we do have time. We'll just squeeze one more question in, as Trish has asked specially to address the question from Caroline CO. Do any of the panel members have experience of conducting site training of the oversight plan with the best practices outlined? Trish?
Yeah, this is one is really, it was really passionate for me. So what I certainly recommend is that we have kind of a brief overview at the investigator meeting, but there's so much at the investigator meeting that this should not be, you know, heightened in a lot of training, because it's going to get lost. So we really need to have like that on-demand training. So there needs to be, you know, subsequent training when data is starting to get collected, so it's not lost in the shuffle, and that's top of mind for sites as well as the site managers and site monitors. So I really recommend having kind of a look at this and really put forth a best effort to come up with a training plan, so it's not just all kind of bundled together and it'll get lost in the transfer. And also coming back to this as a global and regional team, looking at these data and looking at these edge case scenarios that come up, so you can proactively kind of mitigate and properly train and get folks back on board.
Thank you so much, Trish. Thank you, Damien. Thank you, Alan. And thank you, Trish, again for your perspectives and for taking the lead on this. And thanks especially to Damien and Trish for leading the project from the CPAS perspective as well. Very much appreciated. So apologies we didn't get to absolutely everything today. Thank you so much for your participation. The contact information for the respective organisations is there for you. If you've got any general questions, please drop a line to the Eco Consortium mailbox listed below. We're happy for any suggestions for this type of material as well. We've got ideas around Eco, and then we're ready to take the discussion forward. So with that, thank you so much again, everyone, for attending. Go and read that paper, and we look forward to further discussion on this topic.